Initially, all we knew of Wolverine was that he was a mutant, and in fact, it was even suggested in the beginning that the adamantium claws that he possessed themselves were actually genetic. It wouldn't be till later that we'd actually learn the adamantium on his skeleton was actually added later on by Weapon X through a painful bonding procedure that few test subjects could survive, let alone benefit from, with the main time that we all kind of figured that out being when Magneto stripped the adamantium from him. That was a thing that was very memorable. Before he was Wolverine though, who was Wolverine? Well, if you ever asked Logan himself, he actually might struggle to answer this question due to all the tampering done to his mind, as well as years of both physical and emotional trauma that his brain had suffered and healed from. It's actually believed that the reason why Wolverine doesn't often remember things from his past is because his brain heals over painful memories, and that scar tissue and his healing factor's self-preservation instincts could contribute to memory loss. But also, Wolvie has been shot and stabbed in the head. A lot, which I think would mess with anybody's memories. If they could heal, definitely not. If you couldn't heal, well, you wouldn't have any memories because you'd be a dead guy. However, while Wolverine might struggle to remember his many pasts, fans of the characters likely won't, or fans that have read his many pasts anyways, including Origins. Before Wolverine was a superhero or even was known by the name of Logan, he was James Howlett. James grew up as a sickly child who actually was perhaps lucky that he even made it to the point of his mutant powers manifesting, although I guess when you consider just how that happened and then everything that came after that and all of Logan's life, Logan might not see himself as being quite so lucky. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's head back to Wolverine's origins. James was raised as the youngest son of a wealthy couple, John Howlett Sr. and his wife Elizabeth Howlett, who lived in Alberta, Canada. However, in truth, he was actually the biological son of Elizabeth and the Howlett's groundskeeper Thomas Logan, born out of an affair between the two. At least, that's what's heavily implied. John Sr. Howlett may have still been James's biological father, but as I said, it is heavily implied that he was not. Still, John raised James as if he were his own anyway, whether this was because he was not aware of his wife's affair or simply because he just felt it was the right thing to do, despite her infidelity, seeing James still as one of his own. We don't really know that much about John Sr. Howlett, although he seemed to have a kind heart, but it is implied that he was the one to deal the death blow to John Jr., James's older brother, doing so in defense of their mother, Elizabeth, after John Jr.'s powers, because he also had powers, manifested and he went into a rage. This likely weighed on John Sr. heavily. Also, yes, if you were wondering, Wolverine had a brother. We'll talk about that more in a bit. Elizabeth Hudson Howlett was Wolverine's mother. Hudson was Elizabeth's maiden name and would actually be a very important name when it came to Wolverine's story later in life, but we'll get back to that in a bit. And it seems likely that when it comes to Logan's X gene, he may actually get it from her side of the family or from his biological father's side, or a combination thereof, though more than likely I think it's from Elizabeth's side of the family. She gave birth to not one mutant, it turns out, but two! Though both sons may have been fathered by Thomas Logan, in the alternate reality of Earth 4011 that appears in Wolverine The End, it is stated that Elizabeth is where Wolverine gets his X gene from. Now of course that's not main continuity, but still some people feel like that's, could also apply to the main continuity. The traumatic and life-threatening experience she had with her first son is implied to be what caused her to be sent to a mental institution. Eventually though she would return, but life would forever be changed at the Howlett estate, with Elizabeth mostly preferring to hide in her room, even neglecting her younger son James as a result. As we have previously stated, young James also had an elder brother who passed away, John Jr. Howlett. John Jr. Howlett may have also truly been the biological son of Elizabeth and Thomas Logan, the groundskeeper, but we don't really know that for sure. What we do know is that John Jr. died young, after apparently also being born a mutant. It's believed that his father killed him out of defense of his mother, who he had attacked. Some believe to this day that John Jr. may even still be out there somewhere alive, possessing powers similar to Wolverine, despite the fact that Wolverine seemed to see his older brother during time spent in hell, which I think would be pretty crazy if we brought him back, but also I feel like if we haven't seen him at this point, where has he been? Aside from his elder brother who passed away, young James also had a half-brother in Dog Logan. Dog was the son of Thomas Logan and an unnamed woman. He grew up on the Howlett estate and became one of James's playmates along with Rose, who was was brought in to live in the estate as a playmate for James, while also being given serving duties as she got older. Dog at one point saved James's life after accidentally endangering it. However, Dog's feelings for Rose and forceful actions towards her, as well as his jealousy of James and all that he stood to inherit, drove a wedge between them as they grew up. Eventually, this division led Dog to attack James, causing him physical and emotional harm, with Dog and his father evicted from the estate as a result of this. Oddly enough, Dog somehow survived to the modern age, despite having been born like Wolverine in the late 19th century. At one point, he has a bunch of time diamonds, which I guess he could use to time travel, so this could be how he's lived so long, or perhaps his longevity is still as of yet an undefined power of his. We haven't seen him for a while, but still, pretty sure we saw him at least in like 2014 or something, so considering it's the 19th century and then we see him in a comic from 2014, that's a little what's happening there? We don't know. Thomas Logan is heavily implied to be the biological father of James Howlett, which seems to have been why he used Logan as an alias in the past. Although, as I've said previously, James's mind also became so addled that eventually he would not remember his true name as James Howlett, and would forget the connection of that name, Logan, to his biological father. So he might have just picked that name he thought randomly, but it wasn't so random. In fact, when Dog eventually comes to look for James and Rose years after they have fled the estate, James initially does not even recognize Dog or remember who he is or that he's a Logan. Thomas was a hard man, driven to drink and often behaving aggressively, especially towards his own son who lived with him, Dog. In fact, this is likely a big part of the reason that Dog turned out the way he did. After both Thomas and Dog were removed from the Howlett estate, Thomas snuck back onto the property, killing the Howlett servants and using Rose to gain access to Elizabeth's room, and of course bringing Dog along with him. There, Thomas attempted to get Elizabeth to run away with him before being confronted by John Sr., who Thomas then just killed. This is what caused James's mutant powers to manifest, as he sort of came into all this chaos, and in a blind fit of loss, desperation, and rage, he scarred Dog and killed Thomas with his bone claws. The trauma of the whole occurrence and its similarity to the tragic event of her first son proved too much for Elizabeth, who blamed herself and took her own life. James and Rose, also overwhelmed, chose to leave the estate, fleeing together. If you thought Thomas Logan was bad, well, I mean, you would be right, but while John Sr. seems like a well-meaning sweetheart by comparison, his own father was more akin to Thomas than his own son in terms of his cruelty. We don't know his name, but Mr. Howlett, or the Old Man, as he was sometimes referred to, is the grandfather of Wolverine and the father of John Sr. He was the one who forged the Howlett name and created their fortune through unknown means. The Old Man was critical of John Sr. and his offspring, and may have even at one point threatened the life of young John Jr. because of his mutant gene. He constantly harped on John Sr., criticizing his parenting skills as he felt James was too weak and too soft. After Dog blamed Rose for the deaths of Thomas, John Sr., and Elizabeth, Mr. Howlett disowned James, although he did still help him and Rose escape town, and years later would actually come to regret sending his grandson away, giving Dog, then his heir and ward, information to help track James and Rose down once more so that he might actually make amends. However, Dog, of course, had some other plans. He was like, yeah, I'll do that. I'll totally do that. I'm not gonna go and try to kill this person who stands to potentially take an inheritance away from me that I just got. Wouldn't do that at all! Oh yeah, he definitely tried to do that. From the beginning almost, young James's life was steeped in tragedy. A tragedy so great, in fact, that he wouldn't even remember most of it as time went on. That's how great it was. Not even Rose, who also tragically died by accident at Wolverine's claws during a fight between him and Dog, after Dog had tracked him down with information given to him by the Old Man. Wolverine would see Rose's spirit in visions when close to death, but not remember her or his own past. He would often mistake her for Jean instead, which kinda makes sense because Rose and Jean do look very similar. And Jean herself has also, of course, appeared in Wolverine's death visions in spirit form. Often too, because half the time Jean happens to be dead in the comics, it seems anyways, so that makes sense. However, this is only the beginning of Wolverine's tragedies. Tragedy would plague Wolverine throughout his family tree, even extending through his mother's heritage and her own family, the Hudsons. Elizabeth Hudson had two brothers, Elias and Frederick. Both survived their parents, who died tragically in a shipwreck. Everything is a tragedy when it comes to any story attached to Wolverine. Even his mother's family couldn't escape this comic book curse. Elias seems to have been the older brother, as he was the one who ended up running the family business, the Hudson Bay Company, which by the way is a real department store company that has strong ties and roots in Canada, so I kind of love that the Hudsons are related to the Hudson Bay Company. Wolverine even at one point unknowingly works for his uncle Elias, who was later driven to take his own life, shortly after Wolverine left. Mental health seems to be something that the Hudsons struggled with throughout their history, probably something Wolverine should watch out for. Actually, I feel like Wolverine has also struggled with that, so I mean we all struggle with that, so fair enough. Frederick, however, ended up working with the Canadian military, overseeing a training facility, a facility that ended up being used by notorious and often confusing Wolverine villain Romulus, who was retconned to have been the mysterious figure making Wolverine's life even more tragic the whole time. Like he even needed help in that department at all, Romulus, jeez. And of course, as Romulus enters the equation, here is where Hudson's involvement with Wolverine gets really weird, but kinda great, but really weird. Logan ended up at the military training facility where Victor Creed, aka Sabretooth, and Silas Burr, aka Cyber, and currently known as Hornet, would also be. Under orders from Frederick, who did not know that Logan was his nephew, Burr was instructed to make Logan's life living hell in order to turn him into a loyal killer. Another of Romulus's agents, Janet, was also used to manipulate Logan through having him fall in love with her, but not of course so she could persuade Logan to do what she wanted, as you can kinda do with people that, you know, love you can kinda convince them of things, but unbeknownst to her, so she could be basically fridged, aka killed, thereby motivating Logan in one way or another. Another classic Romulus plot. Frederick himself would later be killed on Romulan's orders by his great-nephew Daken, aka Akahiro, the son of Wolverine. Frederick never had any children with his wife, but did have an illegitimate son with his secretary, whom she vengefully named Frederick Hudson II in order to hurt Frederick's relationship with his wife. Take that, Frederick. His secretary Caitlin MacDonald took her own life sadly shortly after giving birth. While Frederick didn't do much of note in his own life, he did have 3 sons who are pretty relevant: Truett, Victor, and James. Frederick II himself died young as the result of a bar brawl, which is a pretty fitting way to go for anyone who's related to Wolverine. Truett Hudson, often referred to simply as Wolverine's cousin, though more specifically Wolverine's first cousin once removed, is one of the most important of the 3. Truett is also known in the comics as the Professor, and while he is also bald, we are not talking about that professor, not Charles, aka Professor X. Instead, Truett was the Professor, also known by the alias Professor Thornton, who became tied to the Weapon Plus program, likely inspiring it as a result of stumbling into a lab in a World War II German camp that actually belonged to, get this, Nathaniel Essex, aka Mr. Sinister. What a strange connection I never thought would exist, and yet it does. From there, Weapon Plus would later spawn the creation and project known as Weapon X, on their journey to create new super soldiers. This was following the success of Project Rebirth, which led to the creation of Captain America, who was labeled by the program as Weapon 1. The Professor would later be put in charge of brainwashing Team X operatives, among them Logan included, and would be known as Director of the Weapon X program. Yeah, that's the thing. That is literally his first cousin once removed, who was running that program. Truett actually also has ties to Dracula, another famous Wolverine enemy. Truett himself would be killed, seemingly and surprisingly, by Silver Fox, who at this point was believed to have actually been alive this whole time, and also now be evil and working for Hydra. And if you don't remember Silver Fox, she's one of Wolverine's first loves. However, in this reality, this probably wasn't actually Silver Fox, but a mutated clone of her. At least, all us Silver Fox fans are hoping that's what happened. Hopefully it's not really Silver Fox. To this day, I think a lot of people say, that's a clone. Victor is the middle child of Frederick II's. He himself was also manipulated by Romulus, because isn't everyone? He acted as Romulus's right-hand man and was shown to be extremely durable and strong, although I don't know if we ever found out if he was a mutant or not. Victor was also born mute as well as blind. He met his end at the hands of Wolverine. Continuing right along with the 3 McDonald Hudson brothers, we also have James Hudson. That's right, Guardian of Alpha Flight. Andrew, are you proud of me? I found a way to work Alpha Flight into this video. Although considering Wolverine's history with the team, that really shouldn't be hard in general to do while talking about him, because he himself has also, been a pretty good ally and sometimes team member of Alpha Flight. But anyways, this isn't about Wolverine's life story. This video is about his relatives and his family connections. Enter James Hudson, also Wolverine's cousin, and half-brother to the villainous Truett. Half-brother because all three brothers actually had different mothers. James was the youngest of the three, which means I got to save the best for last. Before Guardian was Guardian, James Hudson developed a suit for Amcan Oil Corporation to be used to help locate underground oil deposits. However, after he learned his suit was going to be sold to the US military and used as a weapon, which he was not here for, he destroyed its plans and stole the helmet of the suit, making it unusable. He then went to the Canadian government for help and protection from Amcan Oil. He would go on to become founder of Department H and the leader and founder of Alpha Flight. James Hudson and his wife, Heather McNeil Hudson, aka Vindicator, would also become fast friends with technical relative James Howlett, ever since they ran into a feral Logan on their honeymoon as seen in Alpha Flight issue number 33, which has a flashback to that. James and Heather have one daughter together, Claire, who would be, I think, a cousin twice removed to Wolverine. So that's also a thing. John Sr. and Elizabeth aren't the only ones with relatives relevant to Wolverine's history though. Thomas and the Logans also have an extensive past, and at least one relative that you might find at least interesting. Folkburn Logan. If Wolverine were to run his DNA through someplace like Ancestry.com, he'd learn that 1. He probably has a lot more kids than he ever knew about, and 2. That he was also related to Folkburn Logan. Folkburn lived back in the 11th century and is referred to by his fellow soldier and friend as the last pagan, living in London, England. Folkburn runs into Thor and the Horsemen of the Apocalypse during a fight between them, and is saved by Thor himself, just as he begins to pray to the old gods, hilariously, which I love, as seen in Uncanny Avengers issue number 6. While this pretty much covers all of Logan's family when it comes to where he comes from and his origins, there's a lot more tragedy ahead for us to explore when it comes to romance and his own offspring. We're running a little short for time on this video, so I'm going to briefly cover some of the major wives/loves and children we've come to know as related to Wolverine in the main comic book continuity of Earth 616. But if you enjoyed this video and you want a specific video about Wolverine's kids, let us know in the comments. Or if you would rather perhaps something a little different, such as hearing me attempt to explain the history of Weapon X, or attempt to explain Mr. Sinister's family tree instead, both of which would probably also be a lot of fun. Be sure to let us know. When it comes to Wolverine's wives, there are two main ones that stick out to me. One of whom he was actually married to, another he was almost married to, but you know, I think we can still count her. She's a pretty big deal. Other than Jean Grey and his weakness for redheads, the major loves of Wolverine's life I would say would be Mariko Yoshida, his fiancée, and Itsu, his wife. Although Wolverine was also shown to be married to the ancestor of a person named Hoshiko in the story Aftermath in Wolverine Exit Wounds, and was once also married to Ophelia Sarkissian, aka Viper. That's a thing that happened. With Mariko, their love did not produce any offspring, but it was a strong love regardless, and they did have a foster daughter together, so that's a thing. Mariko was introduced in X-Men issue 118, and we'd come to know her as the daughter of Lord Shinjin, the leader of Clan Yoshida, a crime syndicate in Japan. Mariko is also a cousin to Mutant Sunfire, which was how she first met Wolverine. The two fell in love and eventually ended up engaged after the death of Mariko's father. However, due to the manipulations of Mastermind, their wedding would be called off. Later, it would be back on but delayed until Mariko felt she had made right the wrongs that Mastermind's influence over her had caused. She died before they could be married though. While she would be resurrected much later, her and Wolverine's relationship would never really recover. Itsu is the wife of Logan, who he met, fell in love with, and married during his time training with Bando Saburo in Japan. Itsu became pregnant but was unfortunately assassinated by Bucky Barnes, aka the Winter Soldier, before her child could be born. Initially, it was actually believed that their offspring did not survive, but later we learned that thanks to the power of the baby's X gene, it actually did survive. The baby was retrieved by Romulus, who left him on the doorstep of a well-off couple that would adopt him. However, Romulus would also manipulate this baby, named Akihiro, but cruelly nicknamed Daken, and now known by the codename Fang, to grow up to hate his father. His biological father, Wolverine, that is. Daken would attempt to destroy Logan while working for the Red Right Hand, seeking out those who were Wolverine's offspring that he either never knew existed or had forgotten about due to, once again, much tampering with his mind and just overall memory loss, and using those relatives as weapons against their father. This group was known as the Mongrels. They died at Wolverine's hands without him knowing of their true origin till after he'd killed them all. Tragedy. tragedy. At one point, Daken and Wolverine would be pitted against one another by the machinations of Sabretooth, leading to Daken tragically being drowned by his own father in a puddle. But don't worry, he returned and later would reconcile with his dad, and now he isn't even known by the name Daken, but prefers to be addressed as Akihiro or Fang. Other prominent offspring of Logans from the main continuity include Laura Kinney, aka X-23, who is also now known as Wolverine, his daughter and also his female clone, Gabrielle "Gabby" Kinney, aka Scout, a clone of Laura, who is also seen as Wolverine's daughter, and Amiko, his adopted daughter, who has spent a lot of time being raised by Wolverine's good friend Yukio, and previously was raised in part by Wolverine's love and fiancé Mariko, prior to her death of course. To really understand this team, we have to go all the way back to their humble beginnings over at Marvel Comics. The team supposedly came to be thanks to a group you're quite familiar with. No, I'm not talking about Marvel, and no, I'm not talking about legendary duo Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. I'm talking about us, the fans. Well, I mean, not me specifically, as I was not alive back in 1963, but the fans who were around back then and reading comics had a need for more Marvel team books. There were many solo hero books out there, but fans wanted to see more team-ups, and so Stan Lee and Jack Kirby came up with the X-Men. Stan Lee had said before that the challenge with team books where new characters were introduced was explaining how they all got their powers, their origins. To simplify this, he had an idea of making the entire team a group of mutants, using that same blanketed reason to explain how they each got their powers. Pretty easy, you can just say, hey, they're mutants. The brilliance of this is that while on paper this sounds like an easy, even lazier approach to some, it actually worked. A huge part of the reason why the X-Men were so successful and why we love them even today is because of their mutant status. Initially, Stan wanted to give them a simple name, denoting this status, the Mutants. But publisher Martin Goodman turned down the name idea, citing the fact that no one knew what a mutant was. Some even believed that the name, the Mutants, could still be used as a good alternative name for the group when they debut in the MCU, but we'll have to wait to find out about that. Instead, Lee decided to take inspiration for the team's name from their leader and mentor Professor X, calling them simply the X-Men. In those early comics created by Kirby and Lee, Professor Charles Xavier, or Professor X, as he'd come to be more commonly known, created a school for young mutants, guided by a dream of peaceful coexistence with humankind. You see, the public was not a fan of mutants, and there were many evil mutants out there that gave mutant kind a bad rap. To combat this, Professor X decided to create a school for gifted youngsters in Westchester County, New York, bringing together a team of young mutants using his telepathic abilities and Cerebro, which we'd later learn was actually created by X and his future student Jean Grey. The initial team and group of students that started it all were Cyclops, Beast, Angel, Iceman, and of course, Jean Grey as Marvel Girl. During these early days, they were also sometimes joined by Mimic, who initially was introduced as a deadly villain that could adopt the abilities and powers of those around him, making him a formidable foe for the X-Men, as he could, mimic all of their powers. However, Mimic would soon after be reformed, and after losing and regaining his powers kind of multiple times, would also end up adopting the OG X-Men roster's power sets permanently. These were the early days of the X-Men, which also introduced one of their greatest enemies, who coincidentally would also throughout the years become somewhat reformed before becoming a full-on anti-hero, or even to some, a full-on hero in modern day comics, Magneto, the master of magnetism, and his also quite infamous Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, who themselves would have many various different versions and rosters throughout the years. Eventually, the X-Men series was taken over by Roy Thomas, beginning with issue number 20. Throughout the continuation of the series, other writers would also help out, and we'd see characters like Havoc, Cyclops' heroically reluctant brother, who was also a mutant, and Polaris, who we'd later learn was the daughter of Magneto, having powers similar to him, introduced. This series would be ongoing until issue number 66, where it would come to a firm stop as sales dwindled somewhat. Up until issue 93 of the series, the X-Men title would only exist to sell reprints of older stories. there's a period there where nothing new is really happening, it's just a lot of reprints. However, with Giant Size X-Men issue number 1, we'd see X-Men return in a big way, finally getting a new tale and ultimately a revival. Len Wein and Dave Cockrum were the creatives behind this first Giant Size, which would become a Marvel and X-Men staple. In fact, recently in 2020, we saw a new Giant Size X-Men series emerge in this similar vein, each issue of that series focusing on a story tied to a different X-Men. In the first ever Giant Size X-Men issue number 1 though, a whole new team of X-Men were introduced, featuring Colossus, Wolverine, Storm, Thunderbird, Banshee, Nightcrawler, and Sunfire. Oh, and Cyclops was also there. Although it should be noted, as I talk about the evolution of the roster, I likely won't mention all members every single time to avoid repetition. I'm also not going to mention every single roster because I could just do that in one video and that could be a whole video. Suffice it to say, there have been a lot of X-Men rosters that Scott Summers has been a part of as well. If he's not mentioned, he might still be on there. The difference between this team and the original X-Men team was that this team was a lot more grown up. The former youngsters had all grown up and this team reflected that, with all new members also being adults as opposed to teens. The Giant Size roster was also unique in that each team member was radically different from the other, having a completely different background, power set, and in many cases even country of origin. This was probably the first roster to really reflect another trait many fans love about the X-Men today: diversity. In terms of the why behind this team, they were brought together to rescue the original X-Men from the deadly sentient mutant island known as Krakoa, currently actually an ally to the X-Men in modern day comics, but once a villain in their history. Technically wedged in between this rescue attempt and when the X-Men ended up in peril was another team initially led by Moira McTaggart, but outside of the canon in real-world comic history, this team wouldn't be retconned into existence until the early 2000s. It would serve to help introduce the youngest Summers brother, the quote-unquote mystery Summers bro, Vulcan. But back to the Giant Size team. They were successful in their rescue mission, and afterwards were left to ask the question, now that all the X-Men were safe and sound, new and old, what are we going to do with 13 X-Men? Well, they wouldn't have to worry about this too much, as they weren't lucky number 13 for too long. Shortly afterwards, Sunfire left the team in a huff, Thunderbird died on a mission unfortunately, Iceman and Angel ultimately moved out of the X-Mansion, and Havoc and Polaris decided to go back to school. Jean Grey as well also left for a period, kind of returning to school, but her romantic connection to Scott Summers kept her mostly active on the team's roster. Jean would also eventually become the Phoenix, sending us down a path towards one of the most iconic X-Men stories, I would say, of all time, the Phoenix Saga, and of course the even more iconic follow-up story, the Dark Phoenix Saga. While the adult X-Men team continued on, there were newer mutants introduced and a second X-Men title was added to make room for them and their stories. This new young team of teen mutants had a book whose title reflected just what they were, the New Mutants, in a way calling back to the simplicity of the title Stan Lee had originally thought up. This era is often considered one of the best among fans, with creative team Chris Claremont and John Byrne often standing out as the main folks we think of when we reflect back on these iconic moments and stories. In addition to the Phoenix Saga, there was also Days of Future Past and God Loves, Man Kills. Many of the stories you've seen brought to life in film and animated series adaptations are actually taken from this time period in mutant and X-Men history. Another spin-off title was added at this time to showcase the tales of the original X-Men roster, the most classic of teams. However, because we already had an X-Men team and title, this book and the team within its pages would become known instead as XFactor. At that time, XFactor was the old roster returning to action, not yet a mutant detective agency. Despite being what most fans associate with that name now, that version of XFactor actually wouldn't become known to us until the early 2000s, with XFactor Investigations making its first appearance in Madrox issue number 1 in 2004, which led into the 2005 XFactor series, which is technically volume 3 of that series. Even more books would be added to what seemed to be developing as somewhat of an X-Men line, I would say. Excalibur appeared as part of Marvel UK's collection of comics. This comic featured 3 X-Men, Nightcrawler, Kitty Pryde, and Rachel Summers, who teamed up on adventures with Marvel UK superheroes Brian Braddock's Captain Britain and Megan. By the time we got to the 80s, we had a completely new roster of X-Men who were featured in the Uncanny X-Men title, which actually is considered to be a renamed portion of the XMen Legacy series. This new roster featured Storm, Wolverine Wolverine, Colossus, Rogue, Psylocke, Dazzler, Longshot, and Havoc, among others. Angel, Nightcrawler, Polaris, Banshee, and Kitty Pryde's Sprite were also present, as was Professor X. This era featured one of my favorite X-Men story epics, Inferno. While the 80s were a pretty magical time for X-Men stories, the party came crashing to a halt somewhat in issue number 251 of Uncanny X-Men, when the team split up! Of course, no cliffhanger here for us living in the retrospective future, as we know the X-Men would and did return. In issue number 254, a new team revealed themselves, coming together on Muir Island, nearby to Scotland. This roster was made up of both mutants and humans, featuring Banshee, Polaris, Forge, Dr. Moira McTaggart, Professor X's son, Legion, Nightcrawler's magical foster sister and also romantic love interest, Amanda Sefton, Brigadier Sandy Stewart, who belonged to the Weird Happenings organization, aka Who, Tom Corsi, Sharon Friedlander, and very briefly, Sunder. This mutant team is often referred to as the Muir Island X-Men. We were also introduced to supporting characters like the Muir Island Morlocks, including Callisto and Healer, and the Freedom Force, which initially featured Destiny, Mystique, and Valerie Cooper, but would kind of become like an alternate Brotherhood roster, to be honest. The core X-Men team, however, would stay pretty much broken up until issue number 270, when all mutants were brought together once more in Extinction Agenda to fight against the cyborg Cameron Hodge. Possibly one of the most famed X-Men creative teams of all time, started to sort out the current state of the X-Men and their fractured rosters as we moved into the 90s. Jim Lee and Chris Claremont. In issue number 273, we got a story called appropriately, Too Many Mutants. Truer words were never spoken, which aimed to rectify all the confusion by finally giving us a new X-Men roster featuring Storm, Wolverine, Psylocke, Jubilee, Gambit, Forge, and Banshee. By 1991, we saw the many mutants coming together once more to take on the evil psionic mastermind known as the Shadow King during the Muir Island saga. After that battle, however, we were once more left with the remnants of three teams all kind of jumbled together. The Muir Island X-Men, the X-Men X-Men, and XFactor. Once again, at the end of XFactor issue number 70, we were left with the question, this time asked by Professor X, what am I going to do with 14 X-Men? No one looks pleased either about this issue on the page where this question is asked, perhaps because they are all upset that Professor X has maybe forgotten them, as he seems to have miscounted, but I assume this is just supposed to be a play on the 13 and we're just one-upping it, because there's definitely people that are not included in that count, including some who are not pictured here, and you know, Professor X himself. There were likely even more than 14 X-Men now gathered. The solution to this question finally came in the form of creating multiple actual X-Men teams. Not spin-offs, but instead two main rosters. This is where the much-loved original X-Men Gold and Blue rosters come in, and this love is in fact proven by sales, with Jim Lee and Chris Claremont's X-Men issue number 1 being known as the best-selling comic of all time. At the time of this recording, there have been a reported over 8 million copies sold, which is pretty wild. The blue team featured Cyclops as leader, with Gambit, Rogue, Beast, Psylocke, Wolverine, and Jubilee rounding out the team's ranks, and briefly featuring Revanche as well. The blue team featured more of the edgy and newer X-Men characters, and was written and drawn by Chris Claremont and Jim Lee. Featured in the pages of the second volume of X-Men from 1991, starting of course with issue number 1, although they wouldn't actually be the blue team until like a few issues later, in terms of like them just being the mainstay. Think about issue 4. The gold team, on the other hand, featured Storm as leader, with members including Colossus, Angel's Archangel, Bishop, Jean, Forge, and Iceman. This team was depicted as the more seasoned and experienced one, showcasing more of the classic X-Men of the 60s and 70s. This team's stories were told in the pages of Uncanny X-Men, kicking off with issue number 281 of the series. I personally love this cover. The creative team involved included John Byrne, Jim Lee, and Wilchi Portacio. The costumes showcased with both teams, designed by Jim Lee, became pretty iconic and served to inspire their looks in the 90s X-Men animated series. To this day, they're still my favorite X-Men suits. The 90s was also the time that we were introduced to the mutant Black Ops team X-Force, who initially started out as kinda like time-traveling assassins made up of the former New Mutants team, who are now being led by big gun-toting, time-traveling son of Madeline Pryor, Scott Summers, and sort of Jean Grey from the future, Cable. XFactor would also continue as a government-funded team led by Havoc and Polaris, and despite the fact that the two mainstay teams were introduced to help simplify the murkiness created by having simply too many characters, the 90s is actually where it gets somehow even more confusing. Despite each team being somewhat tied to a specific X-Men title, these titles both had X-Men in the name, and often stories unfolded and were woven through multiple series, meaning you needed to collect multiple titles to get the whole story. While this can be fun at the time of collecting, it can also be exhausting, and expensive, and confusing to figure out when you're returning back to older stories. Both teams actually lived in the X-Mansion, but simply went on separate missions. Starting in 1993 with Uncanny X-Men issue 298 and X-Men issue number 17, the teams also started to swap members for certain missions, making everything even more confusing for readers to try to discern between the two once very distinct rosters. During this era, however, we did get many memorable and character-defining stories, including Fatal Attractions, Phalanx Covenant, and the Onslaught event. But by 1994, the terms blue and gold had kinda lost all meaning, with both teams pretty much melding together. By 1998, the roster had shrunk down to 8 core members, including Wolverine, Storm, Nightcrawler, Colossus, Kitty Pryde, Rogue, Gambit, and Marrow, surprisingly, with stories featuring the team continuing to weave back and forth between Uncanny X-Men and the X-Men series, starting with issue number 360 and issue number 80, respectively. Since the 90s, there have been a slew of other important stories as we moved into the 2000s and beyond, including the alternate timeline Ultimate X-Men, E is for Extinction, House of M and M-Day, Messiah Complex and Messiah War, Schism, Avengers vs. X-Men, Inhumans vs. X-Men, and Resurrection. There have also been countless X-Men books featuring multiple teams, many of which simply refer to themselves as the X-Men, even when a mainstay X-Men book was also already ongoing alongside them, which means we get a lot of stories, but also making sense of the X-Men roster gets more and more confusing. These titles have included The Amazing X-Men, The Astonishing X-Men, Extreme X-Men, New X-Men, which was the mainstay at the time known as the Grant Morrison era of X-Men, XMen Legacy, Young X-Men, Wolverine in the X-Men, which is actually one of my favorites, All New X-Men, which featured the time-displaced OG X-Men, X-Men Gold, Spider-Man in the X-Men, Extraordinary X-Men, the 2017 relaunch of Blue and Gold teams with X-Men Blue and X-Men Gold. And then of course there were all the books that were simply known as Uncanny X-Men and X-Men, including one volume of the series simply titled X-Men from 2015 that features an all-female roster of mutants led by Storm that I feel like no one really ever talks about for some reason. I still can't believe how seemingly quiet the hype surrounding that series was, and I know that not a lot of people were super here for it, but also, what a cool team! I suppose it all pretty much goes to show you that by the 2010s, people were pretty much overwhelmed with X-Men content, with the mutant hype receding for some time. To give you some more perspective here, despite the initial X-Men series being consistently returned to, sometimes renamed, but often maintaining or returning to actual legacy numbering, we are still also on the 6th volume of the X-Men title with the 2021 series. Pretty crazy to think, considering how long some of those other series went on for. The modern age, however, has seen a great boost to X-Men popularity, and I have to say I feel lucky to be one of the folks reading along through this entire era. In 2019, Jonathan Hickman and Pepe Larraz became the main creative team behind House of X and Powers of 10, which kicked off the era of X-Men we are in now, which I like to refer to as the Krakoan era. This has been a 3-part multi-year saga that is still ongoing, spanning a number of series in the double digits. The 3 major acts of this epic can be divided between Dawn of X, Reign of X, and Fall of X. Events have included one of my all-time favorites, Ten of Swords, the Marvel-wide crossover AXE Judgment Day or Axe, and SOS, aka Sins of Sinister, as well as recurring yearly Hellfire galas, which we can all dress up and attend in our minds. However, the X-Men history and family will continue on as the Krakoa era is soon coming to a close, with 2023's Hellfire Gala being advertised as the last. Kang the Conqueror is often considered to be the prime Kang, while other versions of the character are either Kang from alternate timelines or perhaps divergent versions of the character who split off through time to follow another path and become known by a completely different name, which sounds like an alternate version but it's kind of a little different. I'll touch somewhat on these alternates while trying to keep us mostly focused on the main Kang, Kang the the Conqueror. Often known for being an Avengers and Fantastic Four villain, Kang the Conqueror is a villain from the future, who often manipulates the timeline in order to bring his plots to fruition. Himself, being a genius, he is also the kind of villain that can sometimes act as an ally to heroes when a threat is too great for them to handle it alone. Oh, and he's also a man of many chairs. He has a time chair that he literally uses to time travel, and he also has this sweet, floating, invisible beanbag chair because he's from the future. I hope in the future we all get invisible beanbag chairs, and guess what? We do, because this video is brought to you by Float, the new invisible beanbag chair. No, I'm just kidding. I wish though. If you invent an invisible beanbag chair, please sponsor us, because I want one of those. Kang the Conqueror is kind of a weird villain with a very unique look, which I think is why so many are surprised to see him coming to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and were surprised when he was revealed to be, you know, kind of a villain that we'd be seeing. Initially, I was one of the people that also thought this was an unusual pick for a villain, especially with him appearing as the seeming main antagonist in the Ant-Man and the Wasp film Quantumania. But then I thought about it, and I realized just how serious of a threat Kang could be if he weren't reduced to simply being one iteration of the character. Kang is not just a universal threat like Thanos was after all, he is a potential multiversal threat. Fighting Kang is like fighting a one-man time-traveling army that is always multiple steps ahead of you, and also an army that seems to fight within itself and only creates more problems by doing that. And also a villain where anyone, even your closest allies, could secretly be manipulated by, or perhaps even just straight up be, a Kang variant. Now, as soon as I realized that the multiverse was what we were building towards in the next phase, Kang's presence made a lot more sense to me. Multiverse of Madness, What If, Loki, and even to a certain extent I would say WandaVision all seem to be pushing towards this idea of expanding the MCU beyond just the home universe. I mean, even Ms. Marvel kind of gets in on that idea with her being able to access another dimension, or at least, you know, we kind of allude to that, we see that a little bit in that series. With Shang-Chi and the Ten Rings, I thought we might be going cosmic when we kind of got that tease where we're talking about where are the rings from, and now I think we're likely going beyond that to other dimensions. I wouldn't be surprised if the Ten Rings were like, I don't know, based in quantum something, or doing some other universal stuff, they came from another world entirely. Kang the Conqueror first appeared as a foe to the Avengers in issue number 8 of their first series. He was created by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, and boy is he a true Jack Kirby creation if ever I have seen one. He's a lot of a lot, and also, I mean, that character design. Super Jack Kirby in the best of ways. Well, Kang was seemingly instantly defeated by having a radiation attack bounced back at him, forcing him to flee on his spaceship despite having somewhat of a natural immunity to radiation thanks to being from the future. This wouldn't nearly be the last we'd see of him, and I would say he almost instantly made his mark as an iconic character in that issue. Man, in the future, what do we have to look forward to? Invisible beanbag chairs and apparently some level of radiation immunity. Sounds pretty cool to me if that's our future. Kang the Conqueror is said to hail from the 30th century, believed to be the future or a version of the future of Earth 616. Kang's home reality, however, is known as Earth 6311, sometimes also referred to as Other Earth. Other Earth is a little bit different from the main reality in that there were no dark ages on this world, so that's also why we don't just call it, you know, the future of 616, and honestly, even if we did, we'd probably still give it another number because we never want to be too specific in the comics with what the future really holds. Instead, this alternate Earth skipped the era known as the Dark Ages. Thanks to rapid advancement, they would end up with a colony on the moon, known as Luna, but unfortunately would succumb to war when both the Earth and the moon colony clashed with one another. As a result, the moon would be destroyed entirely, completely obliterated, and its pieces would rain down on Earth, causing massive destruction and leaving the people of planet Earth largely scattered and isolated. Other Earth would also be a world that Reed Richards' father, Nathaniel Richards of Earth 616, would travel to, unite together, and ultimately lead alongside his wife, Cassandra, who hailed herself from Earth 6311, helping Other Earth to recover from a devastating war. Cassandra herself, I believe, is a princess in that future, so, you know, that happens and then you can rule together. However, Cassandra would eventually come to covet the power she held and become known as the villain Warlord, unbeknownst to her husband. But eventually the Fantastic Four would travel to Other Earth and help to defeat Warlord. Years later, Cassandra and Nathaniel's children would rule, truly ushering in an era of peace. It was during this time that Nathaniel Richards was born. No, not Reed Richards' father, Nathaniel. His possible future descendant, Nathaniel Richards. Are you confused yet? Although some signs actually point to this Nathaniel, who would become Kang, as a true descendant of Victor Von Doom instead, aka Dr. Doom, the Fantastic Four villain. And others still seem to reconcile both of these records, implying that Nathaniel Richards of Earth 6311 was actually a descendant from both Reed and Victor, somehow. When I say that, I always imagine like a ship of Reed and Victor together and they're like in love, and then somehow Nathaniel's descended from that, but that's not exactly what we mean here, I don't think. When Nathaniel was just a teenager, one of his first other personas entered the chat. This was the person many of us got excited about as potentially existing in the MCU. Iron Lad. Iron Lad is a member of the Young Avengers, acting as the team's version of Iron Man. When Iron Man ends up getting help from a kid named Harley Keener in Iron Man 3, many people believed this could actually be a version of Iron Lad and we could see Iron Lad in the MCU. And now, with Kang being introduced into the MCU in Quantumania, many believe we could yet see a more comic book adaptation of Iron Lad via Jonathan Majors. Perhaps another alternate version of Kang, where instead Kang becomes the hero known as Iron Lad. This current theory comes from the comics, where Iron Lad, member of the Young Avengers, is later revealed to be a teenage version of Nathaniel Richards of Earth 6311, aka a past version of Kang, before he obviously became Kang. Iron Lad comes to Earth 616 to hide, and hopefully seek help from the Avengers to protect him from his future self, refusing to grow up and become Kang. He's basically looking for a way to avoid that. In fact, Kang the Conqueror would even end up having a comic series with his younger self, Iron Lad, in 2021, titled Kang the Conqueror. Now this 5-issue mini would be all about Kang basically trying to teach his younger self and young Nathaniel wrestling with his own fate and destiny. Kang was basically trying to get him to accept him becoming Kang and like teach him how to be like the best Kang he can be. This wouldn't be the only version of young Kang that we'd come to know though. In addition to Iron Lad, there is also Kid Immortalus, I believe in comic book history, who came into existence following Nathaniel's time as Iron Lad. While Iron Lad made his first appearance in the mid-noughts in Young Avengers issue number 1, Kid Immortalus made his first appearance back in 2013 in FF issue number 8, the second FF volume. Not to be confused with the second Fantastic Four volume, which is a different title. So when I'm saying FF, I literally mean the letters FF. And I know that's confusing because FF is often used as a short form when we're talking about the Fantastic Four. But this time around, well, it is also being used in that context in terms of, you know, what the book is about. It's also literally just FF if you're looking to follow up on that series and you're trying to Google it. Even when we aren't directly talking about time travel stuff in Kang's history, it can be confusing to follow. So hopefully you're following along with me here. Let me get my chart. Are you following along all this weirdness? Despite these adventures through time and the attempts young Nathaniel made to avoid ever becoming Kang, he would end up doing just that, becoming Kang. This part of the story, however, hasn't really been documented yet and is a bit of a gap in his history. What we do know is that Kang and other versions of him across time do exist, implying that even after his time as Kid Immortalus and Iron Lad, Nathaniel Richards returned to his own timeline and eventually would decide to time travel, although it's unclear if his memories of being either of these younger personas remains with him or not. Eventually, Nathaniel would turn to time travel as a way to apparently alleviate boredom, coming to the ancient past and settling down in Egypt, where he would be known by another name, Ramatut. Nathaniel would indeed become Pharaoh Ramatut, living as a ruler in Egypt until the time-traveling Fantastic Four showed up and stopped him. Because, you know, that's what they do. Following this, Ramatut attempted to return back to his own timeline from there, but he got caught in a time storm along the way, as I guess is warrant to happen when you are time traveling. Admittedly, you know, I don't recall hearing of many other time storms in the history of Marvel Comics, but they must happen, and you know, maybe they're just a little bit more rare. We only hear of them every now and then. I think Wolverine did end up in a time storm once with Puck when they traveled kind of through a picture back to a war-torn 1930s Spain, but you know, other than Kang, I think that's about all I can think of. Let me know in the comments all the time storms you can think of. Oh wait, I actually think my insult of time storms has caused one to head our way. Oh no, hurry, click the like button to save me from being displaced through time. Help! Whew, okay, thanks to those of you who clicked like, that was a close one. And to all of you who did not click like, I want you to know that my life flashed before my eyes. Caught in the time storm, Ramatut ended up displaced in modern day Earth 616. There he met his possible ancestor Dr. Doom and was inspired to give up his Ramatut persona to become more like Doom. Which honestly, fair enough. If I met Dr. Doom, I'd also probably be like, you seem cool, I'm gonna do what you're doing. This was how Nathaniel would go on to become Scarlet Centurion. It was also later revealed that the time storm he was caught in was actually all done by Immortalus, yet another time-divergent version of Kang. Apparently, Immortalus created time storms to prevent Kang from creating certain alternate reality selves and to stop him from, I guess, like tampering too much with the timeline. Often in comics, Kang's most dangerous enemy tends to be like another version of Kang, and Immortalus and Kang have definitely both acted against one another throughout their histories. Scarlet Centurion didn't quite work out for Kang as an identity. He ended up encountering the Avengers in the Avengers 1968 annual, and this would be similar to how his first ever comics appearance would go, in the sense that he would end up being pretty handily defeated here. This prompted him to abandon the Scarlet Centurion look and name and return once more to being Ramatut, which, after all, I suppose, had been much more successful in comparison, so that makes sense to me. As Ramatut, Nathaniel would once more attempt to return home to the future of the 30th century, but alas, more time storms. Ramatut goes to check the weather. Dang time storms, time storms, time storms, jeez! All weather channels are forecasting time storms all this week. How am I supposed to travel through time in this terrible weather? This is awful. Also, this weatherman, Immortalus, he sure looks familiar to me. Oh well, whoever he is, he certainly is a handsome devil, I'll say that. Once more being tossed up in another time storm, Ramatut instead missed his stop in the 30th century, instead being catapulted even further into the future, into the 40th century. There, he discovered primitive beings fighting with sort of past technological weapons they no longer seemed to fully understand. At this point, Ramatut fancied himself a sort of a master of past tech and weapons and figured, screw it, I could just rule these people. I have the knowledge to do it, so why wouldn't I? And so Nathaniel reinvented himself once more as Kang the Conqueror. Finally, we're there! He succeeded in conquering this far-flung future, not just the planet, but beyond, building his own galactic empire. However, Kang still found himself thinking back to the past and the modern era of Earth 616. Not fully satisfied with what he had accomplished here in the future, he set out to become the ruler of Earth 616 as well. It's also believed that his ambition to rule the time period of Earth 616 was also tied to the fact that he'd heard a tale of a celestial Madonna, who had become the mother of the most powerful man in all of known history. Basically, Kang wanted to become the baby daddy of that most powerful figure, which is kind of a weird thought when, like me, you know that the celestial Madonna turned out to be the hero Mantis, and that her baby would grow up to be the half-human, half-Kotati Sequoia, aka Koya, who recently was one of the main villains of the Empire event a few years back. I wonder if there's a future where instead of the Kotati resurrected version of Swordsman being that baby's dad, Kang is his dad instead? I would read that what if it does not yet exist. Who is Mr. Sinister? Mr. Sinister was originally known as Nathaniel Essex. He is one of the greatest mutant geneticists the world over. Over the years, he has perfected the cloning process, created chimeras, sparked new life, altered his own DNA to make himself mutant, manipulated others' powers, increasing, decreasing, or better focusing them, and has augmented victims with his own DNA, altering them forever by kind of bonding them to himself. Before we travel back in time to the beginning of Mr. Sinister's weird and wacky story and origin, let's talk about his comic book origins in regards to his first chronological appearance. Mr. Sinister was first mentioned following the devastating attack on the Morlocks, often referred to in the comics as the Mutant Massacre. Following the attack in issue 212 of Uncanny X-Men, we get the first mention of him. Wolverine is hot on the trail of those responsible attempting to hunt them down when he runs into Sabretooth, because of course Sabretooth is involved in this dastardly plot. Startled by Sabretooth's appearance in the sewers, but not at all shocked, Wolverine exclaims, "You're part of this?" Sabretooth responds, "Yep," adding, "Mr. Sinister's dealing a game that don't allow for wild cards like the Morlocks, or you X-chumps either. So he sent the Marauders to resolve the situation, cause we're the very best there is at what we do, like you used to be." This was the first mention of Mr. Sinister, who would make his first visual appearance appearance almost 10 issues later in issue 221 of the series. Sporting pointed teeth and a scowl that to gaze upon would likely leave you paralyzed with fear, Mr. Sinister's ghostly white nightmarish face appears on the very first page of this issue. He lets out a growl expressing his disappointment in how the team have failed to eliminate one of his creations, Madeleine Pryor, who he wanted destroyed and disposed of to cover up his own connection to her. "You failed me, Marauders, and failure is something Mr. Sinister does not tolerate." I'm here for it. I'm here for the creepy stuff. Mr. Sinister is one of my favorites. Mr. Sinister's connection to both the Morlocks and Madeleine Pryor run even deeper than you can imagine, though, and extend all the way back to Victorian England and the character's origins as he transformed from Nathaniel Essex, esteemed scientist, to something much more, well, sinister. As a child, Nathaniel Essex loved watching the busy flow of traffic. He enjoyed studying the patterns of people's movement and predicting which way people would go, observing that they always seemed to follow preordained paths. This would be the beginning of Essex's obsession with predictions. In the limited team-up series, Further Adventures of Cyclops and Phoenix, we learn more about Essex's origins. I also just love the art in this series. It's kind of a cool series to revisit. I like that I get to do this video so I can revisit it. Here we learned that as a man, Mr. Sinister was actually a respected scientist who married Rebecca Milbury, back when he was of course Nathaniel Essex. Tragically, their young son passed away as the result of multiple birth defects. Struggling with grief, Nathaniel coped by burying himself in his work, struggling to accept the passing of his son. Essex became obsessed with Darwin's theory of evolution. He believed too many scientists were limited by their morals when it came to ideas and experiments. Why do we have morals? Ugh, what a waste of time! I don't have time for these morals. Essex predicted the existence of mutants, believing they would emerge as a result of natural evolution. He predicted that humanity would evolve rapidly thanks to what he referred to as XFactors. You know you're a scientist when you're naming things after yourself. As a result of this far-out theory and questionable experiments, he was disgraced and kicked out of the Royal Society, though really due to his questionable experiments, which were pretty Frankensteinish, to be honest. Around this time, Essex would ally with his first ever team of Marauders. Not these Marauders. These Marauders! And have them collect all sorts of deformed ne'er-do-wells from the streets of London to become his unwilling test subjects in mad science experiments. While working for Essex, the Marauders woke up the powerful mutant known as Apocalypse, who had been in hibernation. Apocalypse asked to meet the leader of the Marauders and was taken to him, posing as a man intrigued by Essex's theories on evolution. During their interaction, Essex learned that his predictions had been correct, as En Sabinur was Apocalypse, a mutant. The duo ran into a time-traveling Cyclops and Phoenix, who were sent back in time by the Ascani. While Nathaniel is tempted to join Apocalypse here, he ultimately instead decides to passionately commit himself to his family and his wife running home, because Rebecca does not like how obsessed he has become of late with his work. Unfortunately, upon returning home, he learns that his wife, Rebecca, has learned of his secret, very creepy experiments and his prisoners, and has freed them all. As a result of the stress of this revelation, she also went into early labor and is now basically on the brink of death. While on her deathbed, she refuses to forgive Nathaniel, labeling him as utterly and contemptibly sinister. Whew, fair. Rebecca's speaking some truths as she dies. Mourning the death of his wife and loss of his family, he ultimately returns to Apocalypse, deciding to become his ally in the end. I mean, I guess what else are you gonna do? Apocalypse is a mutant who perfectly represents Essex's hypothesis regarding mutants and evolution. Apocalypse is his theory in essence come to life. Apocalypse painfully genetically mutates Essex using celestial technology, making him his first prelate, which is also, you know, just how Apocalypse do. With Nathaniel taking for himself the name his wife gave to him on her deathbed. Sinister. Sinister allowed Apocalypse to remove his humanity from him, leaving him with no moral code to speak of going forward. However, in his fight against Cyclops and Phoenix, he found himself pretty fascinated by them. Believing Apocalypse, his new master, to be cruel, without purpose, and therefore insane, Sinister decided to reject him, betraying him by unleashing a deadly plague that Apocalypse had him make, but only releasing it on his master, thereby forcing Apocalypse to return to hibernation. Sinister would go on to say that cruelty without purpose was ignorance, and that ignorance was the greatest enemy of science. But if you're cruel and you have a purpose, then you're just apparently a great scientist to Mr. Sinister. Phoenix and Cyclops returned to the future, and while their mission to seemingly stop Apocalypse was successful, it would turn out that the true plan Clan Ascani had for them was to inspire Sinister to set into motion plans that would one day lead to the birth of Nathan Summers, aka Nathan Dayspring, aka Cable. So yeah, that's how closely tied Mr. Sinister is to the Summers family. His obsession surrounding the Summers and the Greys in the future would actually come from his interaction with their future selves who had journeyed into the past. Wild, right? I hope you're following me with this timey-wimey stuff. In the 1999 Gambit comic series, we learned Sinister had moved from England to America. Sinister's appearance in Gambit series also makes sense given their history, where Sinister was shown to be a regretful ally, later enemy, who Gambit becomes indebted to. Although that wouldn't happen until the future. The future past? The future. Confusing. Time travel again. But we'll talk about that part later anyways. While in the Americas, Sinister would adopt the name of Dr. Nathan Milbury, taking his wife's surname. He would run the Essex Clinic as an obstetrician. There he would also continue to conduct morally devoid experiments and would even continue to study the genetics of Daniel Summers, one of his prisoners and test subjects back in England who had escaped. Or at least Daniel had thought he escaped Essex. Apparently he didn't, unfortunately. Sinister would also experiment on Amanda Muir and made deals with her to acquire several of her babies after they were born for his own purposes. Amanda Muir would go on to become one of the founders of Weapon X, an evil woman tied to the Summers family tree known as Black Womb, and Daniel Summers also tied. For more on Amanda Muir and Daniel, you can check out our part 2 video for attempting to explain the Summers family tree. Despite Gambit not actually being alive at the time, in terms of he wasn't really born yet because it's the past, Sinister would first meet him in 1891. This was possible because Gambit and a shapeshifting mutant named Courier had traveled back in time. Upon meeting Sinister, the two made their first deal. Sinister agreed to free Thieves Guild members and give Gambit information in exchange for a sample of Courier's genome. Sinister would blend Courier's genes and abilities with his own and end up teaming up temporarily with Gambit. However, the Thieves Guild members involved would have their memories wiped and therefore would not remember these events. So, in case you're wondering why they don't remember, that's why. At this point, Sinister was not yet Mr. Sinister, to be clear, but was known simply as just Sinister. The name change might not seem like a big difference, but in regards to the character and his identity, it actually is. Mr. Sinister had a completely different personality in comparison, being more feral in nature. This personality actually developed after Sinister returned to his old home, the Milbury house, in 1895, to conduct more experiments. It was then that he learned he was dying and developed the Mr. Sinister persona. He had a kind of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing going on in regards to this split, struggling with episodes as he continued to deteriorate. Essex would run into Mystique and Destiny, who found him as part of their own investigation. They had him taken to Bedlam, where he died overnight. However, this wouldn't be the end for Sinister, as we learn in Immortal X-Men issue number 8. Mystique and Destiny would learn that prior to his death, Sinister had cloned himself 4 times, with the goal of surviving in clone forms to the 20th century and beyond. Each one of his clones was marked by a symbol belonging to a different card deck suit. The Diamond clone is still known as Mr. Sinister and is a mutant. The clone of Clubs we know is Dr. Stasis, who appears to be human. The other remain unknown at the time of this recording, though I imagine the Sins of Sinister event will shed some more light on their stories, and we might actually know more if there's something that I missed or didn't read, which, if that's true, let me know in the comments because I'd love to read it.
Issue 1 begins with a quote by Carl Jung that sets the tone for the story. Man is on the whole less good than he imagines himself or wants to be. At a gas station, a teenage girl is shopping for a drink while a drifter looks at a newspaper that talks about how the Hulk is assumed dead. An armed robber comes in and tries to rob the cashier, but is spooked when the girl drops a glass bottle in shock at the sight of him. He instinctively turns and shoots the girl. The drifter is shocked at this and starts to get angry. Before we can find out if the robber will like him when he's angry, he shoots the drifter in the head, seemingly killing him. The cashier begs for his life, but not wanting to leave any witnesses, the robber kills him too. We are then introduced to a reporter named Jackie McGee. She is clearly a riff on the investigative reporter Jack McGee, who was hunting the Hulk in the classic 1970s Incredible Hulk television series. Jackie is covering the robbery robbery for the local paper and is informed by the local police captain that they are not optimistic about finding the murderer. Meanwhile, in the morgue across town, night falls and the Drifter comes back to life, transforming into the Hulk. Hulk goes after the distraught robber, who we learn was only stealing to try and pay off a debt to a local biker gang so he can support his family. Hulk attacks the gang and chases the robber, who he soon corners. Hulk, who by the way is extremely articulate in this series, asks if the gun made him feel powerful and if he secretly wanted to shoot those people to feel that power unleashed. The robber begs for mercy, saying that it was a mistake. I'm not a bad guy, am I? Hulk closes in on him, retorting, "What do you think?" The next day, Jackie is talking to the police in the hospital. The entire gang has been severely injured, and the robber may never wake up and has almost broken every bone in his body. The police reveal to Jackie that the gang members are claiming that it was the work of the Hulk, and that Bruce Banner must not be dead. In a nearby motel room, Bruce sits contemplating his own morality, asking his reflection if he is a bad person. Issue 2 begins with Bruce having a nightmare about the hours after his exposure to the gamma bomb when he was believed to be in the walking ghost phase. The walking ghost phase is a real term used to describe the hours after exposure to severe radiation where the body has yet to show symptoms of the horrible death that is to come. Bruce remembers the terror of feeling fine, but hearing the clicking of the Geiger counter telling him that this was not the case. The frustration of this triggered a Hulk out. As Bruce wakes up, we learn about what his life has become. He is on the run, owning nothing, not even the clothes on his back, which he always loses when the Hulk comes out. He survives by begging or stealing what he can during the day, but remarks that the night belongs to the Hulk. This is a throwback to the very first Hulk comics, where rather than being triggered by rage, Banner's Hulkouts were triggered by the rising and falling sun. This was the cause of the transformations until Incredible Hulk number 4, when Bruce began triggering the transformations with the use of a machine. It wasn't until about a year later in Tales to Astonish number 60 when the Hulkouts began to be triggered by emotional outbursts. Bruce has found that the Hulk is able to guide him to situations where he is needed with an almost psychic accuracy, and has been spending his time trying to do good to atone for his past sins. This brings him to a small town where several people are dying one after each other. This chain of grief started with the death of the town's star quarterback, whose father was a doctor specializing in radiation treatment. Bruce visits the graveyard and realizes that the quarterback's grave is giving off gamma radiation, and that the string of deaths is a result of people visiting the grave, getting radiation poisoning, dying, and then infecting their loved ones when their graves are visited. Bruce tries to call in an anonymous tip to the government, but in order to be believed, has to reveal his identity to the operator. He climbs a mountain and finds a glowing green cave, where he discovers the radiation doctor, Dr. Fry, who has been transformed into a glowing green ghost-like gamma creature. A walking ghost, if you will. He is surrounded by the dead bodies of people who discovered the cave that he has been killing in order to avoid them knowing he is alive. He attacks Bruce, but Hulk comes out. Fry admits to the Hulk that after his wife died, he started fearing death, and in order to avoid it, created his own gamma formula inspired by Banner's work. It seemed to work, with no side effects, so when his son announced that he was going away to play football at college, Fry gave him the formula to help him avoid injury on the field. Unfortunately, it turned out that the reason Fry hadn't had any adverse effects was because he had developed a minor tolerance to gamma radiation due to his constant exposure to it through his work. His son got sick fast, bleeding green out of his eyes and throwing up green bile worthy of Danny DeVito's Penguin. The son started talking about how he could see a green door below them and that someone was looking through it. He died, and soon after, Fry began transforming into a gamma creature. Hulk explains the consequences that his actions have had on the town, and Fry begs for his life as he is still afraid of death. Hulk tears off his limbs and buries him in the cave, sealing off the entrance, leaving him to spend eternity buried alive and alone. The issue ends with Fry reconsidering his position and screaming and begging for a death that will not come. Something I can relate to as someone who saw X-Men Dark Phoenix in theaters. Issue 3. Jackie McGee is interviewing people who witnessed an incident involving the Hulk and the villain Hotshot. Each witness is giving a very different perspective on the events, with each of their stories being drawn in a different art style. Hotshot had taken a church hostage because he believed that his girlfriend Jess had been possessed, and he wanted to get her an exorcism. Like Dr. Fry's son, she had been rambling about a green door that she had been seeing in visions. Hulk busts in and stops Hotshot, and Jess is found dead in a motel with her head spun the wrong way around. The words "green door" have been scrawled on the wall. Hotshot is blamed for her death and hangs himself in prison soon after. Jackie puts the story together but gets a phone call from Walter Lenkowski, aka Sasquatch of Alpha Flight. He also wants to find Bruce as he needs help with an issue he is having with his Sasquatch side. Issue 4. Walter arrives in South Dakota to talk to McGee. He explains his origin to her. Although a Canadian, he was attending Penn State University on a football scholarship, where he was rooming with a young Bruce Banner, who had transferred to Penn for a semester to use their Gamma facilities. Although most considered Walter a jock, he also had a passion for science and was inspired by his roommate to start learning about Gamma and became his research assistant. Bruce would sometimes go off on Walter, resenting the fact that he was already beloved as a football player and was trying to also become a Gamma scientist, something Bruce considered his territory. Walter went on to be a football star until he saw on the news what Bruce had become. He made it his mission to replicate Banner's work in a more controlled fashion, and using his NFL fortune and help and funding from the Canadian government's superhero monitoring agency, Department H, conducted an experiment quite similar to the one that transformed Banner into the Hulk in both the 70s TV show and the 2008 MCU film. The goal was to create a creature that could act as a deterrent for the Hulk, but as the experiment was conducted in the Arctic Circle, where the walls of reality are thinner, Walter became Sasquatch and saw the green door. A demon known as Tanarak entered him and started causing trouble, but that issue was dealt with all the way back in Alpha Flight Volume 1, Issue 23, and Walter insists that he has been demon-free ever since. Now that I've gone on my traditional tangent about Alpha Flight, let's get back to the Hulk. Walter's story causes Jackie to remember an incident when she was a child, where the Hulk went on a rampage in her hometown when she was a child and she saw him, developing a lifelong obsession with the Jade Giant. She and Walter begin tailing Bruce, stopping at bars where he has been spotted to try and find out where he is going. At one of these bars, a fight breaks out, and while trying to break it up, Walter is stabbed in the back. He is forced to experience every Canadian's worst nightmare while traveling in the States and is taken to the hospital for a no doubt very expensive surgery. While sitting in the waiting room, Jackie wonders why Walter didn't transform into Sasquatch when he was stabbed. Bruce shows up and talks to Jackie, telling her that they need to evacuate the hospital. In the operating room, Walter transforms into Sasquatch and begins attacking the surgeons. Issue 5. Issue 5 begins with a flashback aboard the Alpha Flight space station. Although originally Canada's greatest super team, Marvel has changed this so that they have become an international task force operating in space, being led by Carol Danvers, aka Captain Marvel. Now, I am not a fan of this. I mean, no disrespect to Captain Marvel, but why the f isn't an American in charge of Alpha Flight? It's our one cool super team. Ugh. Anyways, stay on topic, Andrew. This isn't an Alpha Flight video, it's a video about the Hulk. Anyways, in this flashback, Carol Danvers tells Sasquatch that the team is concerned that he is getting more aggressive in the field. Longtime team member Puck points out that it is becoming increasingly rare that Walter is seen in his human form. Walter brushes off their concerns, but when in private, discovers that it is becoming more and more difficult for him to return to his human form. In the present at the hospital, Banner gets McGee to evacuate the hospital while he goes to confront Sasquatch, who has eaten his entire surgical team. Bruce asks Walter if they can talk, but Sasquatch says, "I'm not Walter," and attacks Bruce, triggering his transformation into the Hulk. They fight, and Hulk deduces that Walter stayed in his Sasquatch form too long, and as a result, something got into him through the green door. The demon controlling Sasquatch reveals that he is actually the spirit of Bruce's evil dead father, Brian Banner. Now, Brian is a piece of work who is responsible for a lot of the trauma in Bruce's life and the death of his mother. He has fought Bruce multiple times over the years and is one of the few people that Bruce and the Hulk fear. This causes the Hulk to struggle in the fight before he realizes that it is Bruce who has a reason to fear Brian, not him. Brian reveals that he is being used as a host personality for some other being known as the One Below All. He uses Walter's claws to blind Hulk. Brian corners McGee, but Hulk absorbs the gamma in Walter's body, causing him to transform back into his human form. Hulk allows McGee to ask him one question. She asks how to become like him, and Hulk tells her to go home home and leaves. Walter wakes up and realizes he no longer has the power to transform into Sasquatch. Hulk realizes that when he absorbed Walter's gamma, he also absorbed Brian Banner into him. Issue 6. Bruce is in a motel. He only has hazy memories of what happened at the hospital, but knows that Hulk has absorbed something from Walter, and therefore hasn't let the Hulk out in 2 days. Hulk writes a note to Banner telling him they must return home. In California, Bruce's wife, Betty Ross, watches reports about the Hulk on the news and reasons that it can't be him, as if Bruce was alive, he surely would have reached out. We discover that her and the Hulk's other allies are being watched by an organization known as the Shadow Base. They have found Dr. Fry and are trying to use him to create a creature that can battle the Hulk. In order to find the Hulk, they decide to use the recent incident with Sasquatch to their advantage. On Alpha Flight Space Station, Walter is being examined by longtime teammate Shaman, who suspects that the force that took him over was creation's other dark half, the one below all. Captain Marvel comes in and reveals that the US government is wanting to extradite Walter and have him put to death for his involvement in the hospital incident. The only way to prevent this is to capture the Hulk and hand him over to the government with the help of a super team that it actually makes sense for her to be a member of, the Avengers. In Iowa, Bruce is making his way home to the Gamma test site where the Hulk was born. Hulk believes that the extra power of the site will give him the strength to defeat Brian. Danvers shows up with the Avengers and tries to take him into custody, but he transforms into the Hulk and prepares to take on his former teammates. Issue 7. Hulk fights the Avengers, managing to take out Thor, Captain America, Black Panther, Iron Man, and She-Hulk, while Captain Marvel works to evacuate a nearby town. Iron Man is weirdly eager to try out a weapon known as the Helios laser. They fire it and it reduces the whole town to ash and turns Bruce into crispy bits. He is turned over to the Shadow Base, who split him into separate pieces and keep the various body parts in jars to prevent Hulk from healing while they study him. The scientists at the Shadow Base are studying Hulk's healing factor as they continue to torture the vivisected hero. On Alpha Flight Space Station, Danvers tells McGee about how the Hulk has been taken by the US government without a trace, as anyone who could give them information has become unreachable. Although he no longer has his powers, Walter is still an expert in gamma radiation and is put in charge of a new team by Captain Marvel with the mission of locating the Hulk. They call themselves Gamma Flight as a bit of an inside joke, although there actually was already a Marvel team known as Gamma Flight. You see, back when Alpha Flight operated under the Canadian government, they had various training teams that heroes would join while they worked their way up to the main team, one of which was Gamma Flight. Ugh, focus, Andrew, it's not an Alpha Flight video. Hulk, you're talking Hulk! In the lab, Hulk reveals that he has been allowing the scientists to study him so that he can better understand himself, and could have escaped at any time. He snaps his fingers, creating a shockwave that shatters the jars, allowing his various body parts to reassemble. He absorbs the cruel scientist who has been torturing him, and escapes to make his way to the Gamma Bomb site. Issue 9. The villain Bushwhacker is working for the Shadow Base and is tracking the Hulk as he continues on his journey. The Shadow Base has made a deal with Carl Creel, aka the Absorbing Man, and have been experimenting on him to make him stronger so that he can defeat the Hulk. The experiments give him the ability to absorb gamma power and turns his skin red. Hulk gets to the base but realizes that it was actually Brian Banner's idea to go there so that he could get rid of the Hulk. Hulk is about to leave when he is attacked by Absorbing Man. They fight, but Hulk grows weaker and emaciated every time he lands a blow. Creel absorbs too much of Hulk's power and ends up absorbing Brian Banner and the One Below All. Absorbing Man's consciousness is transported to another realm where the One Below All appears before him in a form Creel can comprehend, and tells him that as a creature of pride, he was always going to end up in hell. Back on Earth, Creel's body tears itself apart in front of a shocked Hulk. Issue 10. Aboard Alpha Flight Space Station, Walter gets a positive ID on Hulk's gamma signature and sets out with Gamma Flight and McGee to track him down. Creel is still stuck in the other realm and cries about how sorry he is. Back on Earth, his mutilated body repeats the words to an unimpressed Hulk, but continues to attack him. Hulk rips out Absorbing Man's spine and uses it to beat the crap out of him. Jackie, Puck, and Walter show up in a ship to try and speak to Hulk, but Bushwhacker uses a sniper rifle to take a shot at Hulk, making Hulk think that Gamma Flight is firing on him. He is sent into a blind rage, and with a thunderous Hulk smash, takes out the ship. Hulk comes to his senses when he sees Creel running towards the test site. He realizes that Brian's plan was to absorb more gamma radiation so he could open the green door. Before he can go after Creel, Puck shoots him with a plasma rifle. Creel absorbs the gamma radiation and opens the green door, transporting Hulk, Jackie, Puck, Walter, and Bushwhacker into the other realm. Jackie asks where they are, and the Hulk turns to her and says, "Welcome to hell."
Tony Stark is the son of Howard Stark and Maria Stark. Howard owned Stark Industries and actually helped his father, Howard Sr., to build the company. From a young age, like Tony, Howard was known for having a brilliant mind, excelling in engineering. He would grow up and end up working with S.H.I.E.L.D., joining them on many missions and aiding their efforts. As a wealthy man, he would also gain access to the Hellfire Club, but was more a member because he enjoyed their parties apparently, as opposed to being aware or aligned with any of their political beliefs and more sinister pursuits. Eventually, Howard would meet Maria at one of his casinos in Monaco. He would return a lost earring to her and help her escape her own bodyguards, who didn't seem to actually have had Maria's own best interests in mind. Not as much is known about Maria's life before she met Howard. What we do know is that she was a socialite and a philanthropist who was born into wealth in Southampton, New York. When Stark first met her at his casino, she was in an unhappy relationship with Obadiah Stane. She went to the casino with the intention of losing copious amounts of money, and this is basically what got her roughly escorted out by her own bodyguards, whom she and Howard would later defeat and of course escape. Maria and Howard would fall in love and later be married, going on to become the only parents that Tony would initially ever know. But Howard and Maria Stark weren't the only parents that Tony would actually have, or at least would later learn that he'd ever had. Tony, it turned out, was adopted. Learning this later in life, it would be revealed that a Hydra agent and S.H.I.E.L.D. agent were actually his two biological parents, one of them being Jude. Jude was a Hydra agent who went undercover at S.H.I.E.L.D. Really though, he apparently had no allegiances, believing both agencies to be problematic in similar ways. Jude was more interested in serving his own interests and profiting off of playing both sides. Jude would meet Tony's birth mother, Amanda Armstrong, a singer who was also working as an undercover agent for S.H.I.E.L.D. while on a mission. The two fell in love and began a relationship, with Jude often traveling to faraway places throughout the course of their few years together. Amanda became pregnant, and shortly before she was due to give birth to their child, Amanda's life was threatened, and then Jude's life was threatened, and Amanda learned of Jude's true beliefs surrounding Hydra and S.H.I.E.L.D. He suggested that they run away together, but unwilling to accept Hydra's money or their protection, Amanda attacked Jude and then ran away. She gave their baby up for adoption, and that was how Tony became a Stark, adopted by Maria and Howard. In fact, the name that the Starks gave to their baby, Anthony, would actually come from Amanda herself, the name that she actually wished her son to have. Amanda had asked Nick Fury to make sure that the baby ended up in a nice and safe home, but Nick basically disregarded her wishes, following the standard S.H.I.E.L.D. protocols instead, which had the baby end up in an orphanage. Howard heard of Amanda and the child and ended up choosing to find and adopt the baby, with him and Maria keeping the name Amanda had picked originally. Years later, when Tony learned the truth of his parentage, he would seek out his biological parents and meet Amanda. After falling into a coma, Jude would also resurface in Tony's life, attempting to capture his son. Despite the fact that Jude had died years earlier in his fight against Amanda, or seemingly died, Jude in fact had been alive most of the time, having been resurrected and returned to life by Hydra and remaining in their employ all these years. But while Tony was the only known child of Amanda and Jude's, he was not the only son of Howard and Maria Stark. In fact, before they adopted Tony, they actually already had a son. Maria and Howard, after being wed, struggled to conceive a child together, and when they finally succeeded, it appeared the life of the unborn was threatened. As a result, they searched high and low for any possible way to ensure that the baby was healthy and that the birth was a success. When Howard learned of an alien being, a Regellian recorder known as Recorder 451, he brought together the Stark Seven in an effort to free the being. After succeeding in rescuing the recorder from its captors, Howard and Maria discussed a way that the recorder might be able to repay them. 451 revealed its plans to help advance the human race so that they would be protected against alien threats in the future, and eventually usher in an era of universal peace. Recorder 451 noted that their unborn child was actually the perfect specimen for this effort, and Howard and Maria were reassured by this when they learned it would also ensure their son's survival. However, Howard would later learn that in modifying the baby to make it more resilient, 451 had also added in kind of like a kill switch. Nervous about this, Howard secretly concocted a bio cocktail to alter the modifications, with the purpose of removing said kill switch from the mix. After the birth of their son, whom whom they named Arno, 451 left Earth, but Howard's tampering with the modifications done to his son ended up resulting in young Arno becoming fatally ill shortly after being born. Fearful of 451's possible vengeance, Howard hid what he'd done in order to protect Arno. Howard and Maria hid Arno away in the Maria Stark Foundation, keeping his existence a secret. They then adopted Tony around the same time and raised him to believe he was actually their natural-born son in order to prevent 451 from getting suspicious should the being ever return to Earth. Howard did record a message for Tony to explain Arno's existence and the truth of his own birth and biological parentage. However, after the deaths of Howard and Maria, the log remained buried for many years before Tony eventually did learn the truth. Arno was initially the lost brother that Tony had never known that he perhaps secretly wanted. Also a genius, as he was modified by 451 to be as such, after Tony learned of Arno's existence, the two would often team up and work together, combining their brilliant minds. Arno would become an ally of Tony's for a time, while Tony hadn't known of Arno's existence until later in his life. From the safety of his hospital bed and iron lung, Arno had actually been monitoring and watching Tony's progress as he grew up. However, while the two were initially friendly and brotherly towards one another, eventually they would be at odds with one another, with Arno becoming delusional and somewhat villainous even. Bruce Banner would trick Arno into helping him in a fight against Tony during Original Sin, and later Arno would choose to betray his brother, allying himself with rival company Banetronics in secret. Tony was made to believe that his body, completely engineered at this point, was more akin to AI and robots than humans, giving Arno the ability to delegitimize Tony as a human being, taking away his rights, his property, and his resources. Arno would become Iron Man, believing that the AI threat known as the Extinction Entity was on the rise. Tony would ally himself with the AI and their right to free will, because, at that point he felt he was more alike to them, and then the two brothers would clash. Eventually, it would be revealed that the Extinction Entity was not real, but merely the result of a delusion on Arno's part. While Arno at this point had believed he had healed himself fully of his fatal disease and effectively removed any flaws from his genetic code, the truth was he was actually still on the verge of dying, as 451 had initially programmed to happen to Arno in his prime. Seeing this, Tony trapped his brother inside his own armor and put him into a stasis. The suit acted as a life support system while Arno's mind was submerged in a virtual dream, where he believed he had defeated the Extinction Entity and was celebrated as a hero. As Tony grew, he would develop a close and loving relationship with his mother Maria, while struggling to establish a strong connection to his father, Howard. This was actually due to the fact that Howard and Tony had very different temperaments, and the fact that Howard turned more and more to drink, making him much more abrasive and causing him to often mistreat Tony. Howard also liked to meddle in Tony's love life and affairs, preventing him from pursuing many of his romantic interests growing up. However, it was later believed that this was done out of a sort of strange kindness, with Howard seeing it as protecting his son. While Tony would think his father was never really proud of him, those close to Howard felt kinda just the opposite, that Howard actually really loved and respected his son and therefore tried to do everything in his power to protect him. Howard and Maria would later perish in a car accident on the Ides of March, but it was later believed that this was no true accident, but a successful assassination attempt on their life. However, it's also been suggested that their deaths were faked and that they could even still be alive today, with Howard confessing prior to his supposed death that the Shield of the Brotherhood had plans to use a car accident to fake their deaths. Following the death of his parents, Tony would inherit and run Stark Industries, create a charity in his mother's name, and would eventually go on to become the hero we know as Iron Man. Iron Man in part was also an identity that was inspired by Howard in a weird way. Howard always had a phrase he'd repeat to Tony that Stark men were made of iron. When Howard was cruel towards Tony, he escaped in tales of fantasy, growing up with the stories of King Arthur and the armor-adorned knights of his round table. Tony fantasized about creating a man made of iron. But while Howard and Maria profoundly impacted Tony and his upbringing, there was another super influential figure who acted as a caretaker for him: Edwin Jarvis, the family butler, and possibly someone who has influenced Tony's life even more than his parents, as Edwin outlived them and continued to serve Mr. Stark following their deaths. Kind of a similar relationship to Batman and Alfred, really. Jarvis became the butler for the Stark family after serving in the British military during World War II, and despite him having a British accent, he may not actually be British by birth, but instead an American who traveled to Britain at a young age to serve in the war and then developed his accent there. Although in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, he does seem to be pretty OG British to me, so I think he's just straight British over there. Edwin Jarvis was influential in Stark's life from a young age. When Tony was young, he had a pet dog named Leo who passed away. Tony was emotional and heartbroken over this loss, being only a boy at the time and honestly, understandably upset. Howard berated him though for his displays of emotion. Jarvis, however, did not, and instead encouraged Tony to express his grief through other means. Tony would use his emotions as fuel, inspiring him to create brilliant inventions. Jarvis has sometimes been relieved of his duties as a butler, forced to resign as a result of injury or of issues with the Avengers, but has always eventually returned to service. Fun facts, he's been brainwashed into becoming an ally of Ultron, posing as villain the Crimson Cowl, and at one point was implied to have a relationship with Spider-Man's Aunt May during her stay at the Avengers mansion. Iron Man's family tree does not end there. While never married, Iron Man has had many romantic relationships throughout the years, though honestly, too many paramours for me to list here. That is best saved for its own attempting to explain the widespread dating life and history of Tony Stark. Tony also has an extended family, including his uncle, Howard Stark's brother, Edward, and his cousin, Edward's son, Morgan. And he also has a grandfather that we've known of, Howard's own father, Howard Sr. Isaac Stark Sr. has also been mentioned as an ancestor of Tony's. Happy Hogan, Pepper Potts, and Rhodey are also all close allies to Tony, who I would consider to be like family to him. While Tony doesn't have any natural born kids in the main reality of Earth 616, you could say that the progenitor who appears during the AXE Judgment Day event is kinda like his offspring, as Tony helped to create the man-made Celestial using his own nervous system as a blueprint in the Celestial's construction. During the King in Black event, Tony also found himself bonded to a symbiote known as the Extrembiote. And finally, there is some weird timey-wimey stuff in his family tree. During the Marvel event The Crossing, Tony was revealed to be a sleeper agent for Lord Immortalus, aka a version of Kang the Conqueror. In order to defeat him, the Avengers got help from a younger version of Tony who would later become time-displaced and actually take over for the original after he died. This would later be reconciled, however, when the younger Tony was combined with the former older Tony Stark, blending the two together to make them one entity, the true Tony Stark. So yeah, that's also a weird part of his history. Arno also created AI robot versions of Howard and Maria Stark known as Arsenal and Mistress. They ended up agreeing to be uploaded to the virtual dream that Tony put Arno's consciousness in order to prevent Arno from realizing that this was a virtual reality and not real life. I'm sure that will never backfire. Oh boy, that's gonna backfire at some point. Where are Spider-Man's parents? While Spider-Man was raised by his aunt and uncle from a young age, his actual parents were Richard and Mary Parker. Richard grew up in New York City and Queens and was actually the much younger brother of Ben Parker, who would of course become a guiding light for Peter as he started out as a young hero, with Ben's loss instilling in Peter the famous motto, "Great power comes great responsibility." Richard was a secret agent working for the CIA, who in fact was brought into the fold by none other than the original Nick Fury. Mary herself was also a secret agent working for the CIA, and both her and Richard often went on missions together, working side by side. They were killed after being found out when they were working as double agents, attempting to infiltrate an Algerian spy ring. The finisher was the one who ultimately did the deed, but was ordered to do so by Red Skull after the Red Skull learned of their true allegiances. Spider-Man's secret sister? Well, Uncle Ben and Aunt May have each played major roles in Peter's life. Before we move on to them, I want to talk about his potential secret sister, Teresa Parker. Oh yeah, Spider-Man has a secret sister. Or does he? Teresa Parker, as we'd come to know her through the comics, was at time believed to be the daughter of Richard and Mary Parker, who they actually had in secret. Because of her birth being kept a secret, she was therefore not raised alongside her brother Peter under the care of Uncle Ben and Aunt May, but instead, she was adopted. Years later, like her father, she too would be recruited into the CIA by Nick Fury. To put it mildly, her origin is confusing. Even for Teresa, she struggled to find the real truth of her parentage. While there are clues that have led her to believe she herself is a Parker, it's possible that she was simply manipulated into thinking this by external villainous forces. It's also possible that her parents were simply shapeshifters impersonating Richard and Mary, and there's actually stuff in Teresa's life that has led us to believe that, which has also been, suggested and implied in the comics, so that could be a possibility. However, regardless of her true origin, after her adventures with Spider-Man, Teresa decided to reject all other alternative origins that were offered and instead see herself as as a Parker, regardless of whether or not she was actually the birth daughter of Richard and Mary. So even if she isn't actually blood related to Peter, she isn't actually the true sister of him, to Teresa, she'll always see herself as his sister. Uncle Ben and Aunt May's origins. Benjamin Parker was the much younger brother of Richard Parker. When he was younger, he fell for one of the prettiest women around, May Riley. However, at the time, having spent most of her life struggling financially, she was attracted to another man who she believed could give her a life of comfort and adventure during a time when economically many were actually struggling. However, Ben came to help May realize the truth about her suitor at the time, Johnny Jerome, who was actually a criminal. After realizing the truth about Johnny and grieving the loss of her first love, May actually began to fall for Ben, and really, the rest is kinda history. Although the couple's life together wouldn't always be easy, and they would still have their own arguments, even almost breaking up multiple times, ultimately their life together was still one filled mostly with happiness and with a lot of love. They were married and did attempt to start having a family, but health complications prevented them from doing so. While his brother Richard and his sister-in-law Mary were killed in the line of duty working for the CIA as undercover agents, Ben and May had been looking after Peter, and actually ended up adopting him after they learned what had happened to the young couple. 3 become 2. While Aunt May would eventually become Peter's rock in his life, initially she was reluctant in her role as his parental figure and basically his adoptive mother. Ben, however, was quick to warm up to Peter and easily transitioned into the role of a father figure for the young boy. And while May thought back to her own childhood and how her parents had blamed her birth for the trouble between them, she would also eventually warm up to Peter. Instead of Peter driving a wedge between Ben and May, adopting him and taking him in actually had the opposite effect for them, strengthening their bond and their love for one another. Tragically, Ben would be ripped from both May and Peter shortly after the young Parker first manifested his spider-like powers. It was actually Ben's loss that gave Peter more motivation to act as a superhero, teaching him that with great power comes great responsibility. With the loss of Ben, May would once again be forced to struggle financially, prompting Peter to get a job at the Daily Bugle as a photographer to help support his aunt. However, this also caused May to worry about her young nephew, as she initially did not know that he was also secretly the superhero Spider-Man, although of course she would come to know that. Who are Peter's grandparents? Did you know that Peter is actually the second of his name? Technically, we should call him Peter Parker II. His grandfather on his dad's side was also a Peter. He and his wife Anne had their names recorded in a copy of the Daily Bugle in 1939, where the birth of their firstborn son, Ben, was announced. Peter and Anne Parker would of course become parents to not just Peter's famous Uncle Ben, but also his father, Richard Parker, as the two are brothers. We don't know much about Mary's parents either, Peter's maternal grandparents. However, we do know that Mary was mainly raised by her father, William Fitzpatrick, whose wife tragically died quite young. Her name is, as of yet, still unknown to us. The former wife of Spider-Man. Did you know that Peter Parker was actually married? There's a whole bunch of stuff there. It's true. As time progressed in the comics, Peter would grow up, going through high school and college, and eventually settling down with his love, Mary Jane Watson. Prior to this, one of Peter's greatest loves was actually Gwen Stacy, and even after marrying Mary Jane, Peter still often thought of Gwen, who died young at the hands of his foe, Green Goblin. Although as Spider-Man, Peter had actually tried to save Gwen, he ultimately failed to do so, and some actually even consider her death his fault, as the tension of his web is believed to have actually caused Gwen's neck to snap. Although Green Goblin has claimed before that the sheer shock of the fall for Gwen would have basically killed her, and that she was already dead by the time his web would have reached her. Why am I mentioning all this in a part of the video where I'm meant to be talking about Peter's wife? Well, because there are alternate worlds and realities where Peter does actually end up with Gwen. In the House of M reality, the two of them settled down together and even had a son, and I think part of Peter always wonders what his life would have been like had Gwen lived. However, Mary Jane was also friends with Gwen and also felt her loss. I also feel like Gwen's death actually brought her and Peter closer together. Peter and MJ's relationship was never really easy, with MJ at first not being very interested in the idea of a committed relationship, and wanting more to focus on her career as a performer and a model, as well as simply just having fun. However, after a few attempted proposals, MJ eventually did say yes, and the two were married for quite some time, even almost successfully starting a family together. And just as there are are alternate realities where Gwen and Peter are together, there are many alternate realities where MJ and Peter are as well, and where they also have kids together, including the alternate worlds of MC2 and Renew Your Vows. However, in the main continuity, their marriage would not last after Mary Jane and Peter ultimately decided to sacrifice their relationship to Mephisto in order to save Aunt May's life, after she was shot in a hit that had been intended for Peter during Back in Black. The children of Spider-Man. While in the multiverse, Spider-Man actually has many children, in the main continuity, he hasn't really ended up with any, at least not currently and not as far as we know right now. He was almost a dad when he and his wife Mary Jane were pregnant with a daughter. Unfortunately, the young, soon-to-be parents were later made to believe, following delivery, that their daughter had actually been lost to them. In reality, we learned that the child had lived, but had actually been swept away as part of Norman Osborn, Green Goblin's own Sinister plans. Despite the hope, however, that one day this child might return to her parents, honestly, I'm still a little hopeful of that, it would later be established that their daughter May had been disposed of later on at the order of Norman Osborn. In the MC2 reality, however, Peter and MJ's daughter does exist and was raised by both of her parents. She would grow up and develop her own spider-like abilities and powers, becoming known at first as the hero Spider-Girl, before adopting the mantle of Spider-Woman. This version of the character is also named May Parker, after Peter's beloved Aunt May, and is often referred to by her nickname of Mayday. Norman Osborn at one point also manipulated twins, Gabriel and Sarah Stacy, to believe that they were in fact the children of Spider-Man and Gwen, while also making them believe that Spider-Man was actually responsible for their mother's death. These children, however, were actually at first revealed to be the children not of Peter and Gwen, but of Norman and Gwen. I know. Fortunately, we'd later learn that this was also not true, and that they were actually clones created by Harry Osborn to torment his father Norman, having Norman's mind manipulated so that he would believe he had slept with Gwen, when in reality, he actually hadn't. Thank goodness. Thank you for fixing that, because it broke my brain. In the main continuity, there is also Master Matrix, who sees Deadpool and Spider-Man actually as his dads, funnily enough. Master Matrix is a life model decoy initially reassembled by Peter's parents, Richard and Mary Parker. After being activated, this LMD would come to see Deadpool and Spider-Man as his parents, and would also work alongside them as an ally. More recently, Matrix appeared in the Amazing Mary Jane series, where he befriended MJ after joining a film crew and also helped to defeat the Savage Six.